I want to begin on a note of, well, apology hyphen explanation, which is that my energy cycle is designed to peak exactly 12 hours from now at 10 p.m. And I have to live a life every day of my life that is designed to peak at 10 p.m. So this is the first time I've ever spoken into a microphone at this hour. So we don't know what's going to happen. It's such a thrill and an honor to be here with Kurt Andersen, and this is just a biographical parenthesis that I want to insert in here for the record, and this is true. Every good thing that has happened to me in my work life is a direct result of having met Kurt Andersen in college, where he became a crucial connector to my future. So I just want that stated at the outset. Thank you. So, of course, we all began, well, the shock had to wear off, so it was probably some hours after we learned that the Electoral College had given the presidency to Donald Trump. We began to wonder, how did this happen? And my original spot was working backwards, and as Kurt and I have discussed, I landed on Sarah Palin, and I went, oh, yeah, so that break in the wall of sanity in presidential tickets allowed for this. And then I just kept going, and I found there were a bunch of accidents that I think contributed to various tears in the fabric of the culture that allowed for this, including, the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky madness, which softened up the political landscape for, Donald Trump's Access Hollywood video and all that. And I found myself going all the way back through the culture. Network television executives, 100% of whom are liberal, sitting around thinking up, how do we do this cheaper than scripted drama and scripted comedy? And they come up with what they call reality shows, which originally were singing contests, right, American Idol, but then they wanted to keep doing it. And so Donald Trump ends up in one of these shows, which becomes a platform for who he is to become. And this fake character that he's going to play, and he's going to play all the way into the presidency. And I'm, at each one of these points, I'm feeling, because he won by just a hair in the Electoral College, if you take out any one of them, you don't have Donald Trump as president. It doesn't happen. And I actually found myself going all the way back to, I think it was 1963, thereabouts, when then Cassius Clay said, "I am the greatest," after he beat Sonny Liston and before he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And what people of a certain age understand about sports and about public presentation of self in those days is that modesty was absolutely key to all athletic achievement, to the point where Ted Williams, who was the greatest baseball hitter when I was a kid in the Boston Red Sox, would not ever acknowledge when he hit a home run the crowd's roar, including his very last time at bat in Fenway Park, where he hit a home run in the early 1960s, and he's rounding third base, and he finally just touches the cap of like that to indicate, I'm acknowledging that you're acknowledging me. And the reason he was afraid to ever do more than that is that you'd think he was boastful. And cut to Muhammad Ali, "I am the greatest." And so boasting became, from that point forward, slowly, eventually, a kind of publicly accepted concept, to the point where Donald Trump stands up there and says, "I'm very smart, I'm very rich," all of those things. And so most of what I'm talking about is completely accidental and seemed utterly harmless at the time. "I am the greatest" seemed fun when he said it. And then I turned to Kurt, who actually traces this back much farther than I ever could, even into colonial times, this American inclination to the acceptance of fantasy in Fantasyland, which is crucial to the Trump thing, because the Trump thing is first, foremost, and always a fantasy. And so I just want to take us through your beginning of this story.
Well, thank you for all of your generous words. I was also, before Trump ever came along, well, on the one hand, I started this magazine called Spy magazine in the 1980s, in which we spent a lot of time covering real estate charlatan Donald Trump in New York. And so I was already on that case, and we made fun of his ambitions at the time in 1988 of becoming president one day, and then 1992 of becoming president. So he was already obviously on my radar.
We need to pause here, because there's an exquisite phrase that entered the culture through Kurt at Spy magazine, which is the descriptor that they used for Donald Trump every time they referred to him in the magazine, and that was
short-fingered vulgarian Donald Trump. Yes, that's my legacy, ladies and gentlemen. So I began wondering about how we got into this place before Donald Trump ever existed. I've been thinking about this book and about truthiness and about the nature of extreme religion in the United States that didn't exist when I was a child growing up in Nebraska, and how that came about. And I started writing this book in 2014. As I was finishing this book, here comes Donald Trump actually apparently having a chance to get the nomination. So he appeared, I hesitate to say providentially, but like providentially to be my poster boy for this strange 500-year history that I'd written about all of the various elements of American credulity, which includes the fact that the first waves of settlers were people who fell for this giant fantasy of America, the New World being a place where they could find gold and get rich overnight and all the rest. To the kind of everything is about selling, the salesmanship that is at the heart and core of the national character from early on, are particular kinds of extreme Protestantism, which makes whatever I feel in my heart is true. I don't need priests. I just need the Bible in my own heart, in my own belief. The kind of anti-intellectualism that was always present. And the short form, in my telling of this history, is that it was always in balance with an establishment, with, for instance, the founders, who, and their heirs in terms of have educated people who were in charge, and the people would believe what they want to believe. And my favorite quote of Thomas Jefferson's from after the Declaration of Independence, during the Revolutionary War, but before we had a Constitution, was that, and it was this idea of tolerance, which is, my neighbor can believe in 20 gods or 0 gods. It's all fine with me. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. It's all fine with me as long as he doesn't pick my pocket or break my legs. And that's my view, and was my view of tolerate any kind of madness, craziness, things I don't believe are true, things I disagree with, whatever, as long, effectively, that it doesn't become part of the public sphere, breaking your leg or picking your pocket in that way. So, we became a nation of show business as well as just business, and everything, when Americans effectively invented show business in the 19th century, from P.T. Barnum and Buffalo Bill on, and it not only did we invent these new forms, but they became part of every business over time. Every business, virtually. Religion, and to the degree that it was a business or not, was also show business in America, as it was nowhere else. Anyway, that's the story of how we got then to the 1960s, which was also, as with Lawrence, a pivotal moment in my history of what happened, all the things he says, and in politics specifically, television had obviously started in the late 40s, or become a thing in network television in the late 40s. By the early 60s, everyone had television, and television had achieved its power over the American mind and experience, and the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates, when we were both little boys, was the moment that, you know, both in history and the idea, but truly, that began, wow, the guy who's good on television did great. The guy isn't good on television, like Dwight Eisenhower wasn't good on television, like presidents didn't have to be until the 1960s. And then, of course, we got to 1968, which is the subject, the politics of 1968 is the subject of a great book by Lawrence O'Donnell Jr. Called Playing with Fire. And that's when many things, as we know, in retrospect, kind of went, in the confluence of them, went to boil and boil over, including, for instance, as Lawrence reminded me the other day when we were talking about this, not a debate, because who remembers the Humphrey-Nixon debates, but a debate between personalities.
Yeah, it was 1968 was the first really contested convention in the way that it was contested, in that it was also the last time that you could get a Democratic nominee for president who did not run in the primaries. In 1968, they had primaries, but they were just, you know, they were functionally focus groups. It was just a way for a candidate to say, hey, look, the voters of California like me. It was never enough to get you enough delegates to actually win the nomination. So Hubert Humphrey ended up with the nomination. And then that was corrected, everyone thought, in 1972. And from that point forward, these nominees are chosen by the voters. And that's a crucial change that we all thought was great. And it was great. And it gave you Donald Trump, because he was chosen by the voters. And that's what I mean by this series of inadvertent events, in the sense that they are inadvertent to causation of Trump. But without them, you don't have Trump. And many of them are things we advocated at the time and would continue to advocate, like voter selection of nominees. And so we are living with this series of kind of accidental outcomes to many good ideas, and then some strange adjustments in social behavior, like now you can boast, and you know, when you score a touchdown now, you do some big demonstration of bragging about yourself in the end zone, which used to be unthinkable, and that's very much a part of Trump's ability to become this boastful madman at microphones.
Well, and the other thing that primaries did and have done, of course, in this showbizification of politics, and especially presidential politics, it made the primaries became an episode in this show, yeah. Right? And it made the horse race the thing that political journalism covered beyond the stakes of the election, as has been obviously the issue of the last this and the last two elections especially. But it's like, oh, who's ahead? Who's behind? How are the polls doing? Well, next week we have Super Tuesday, the most exciting episode in this show. That was a new thing. I mean, another thing, again, that Lawrence is writing a book that I can't wait to read about FDR in the 1944 election. We were talking about how in the late 60s, and again, as a good thing, journalism became much more routinely adversarial than it had been. But the television performance of adversarialism as just the absolute default in presidential press conferences, you know, okay, we get why people did that with Richard Nixon or Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, but as a thing, that's just how they do. It has some downsides. And again, Lawrence was describing to me a couple weeks ago, one night, about how press conferences, as such as they were, took place during the war, during FDR's time in office. I mean, I find it fascinating.
Yeah, so the president who did the most press conferences in history, over 900 as president, was Franklin Roosevelt. Function of time in office, but also because he would do them twice a week, and he would do them in the Oval Office. He'd be sitting at his desk, and the theory, the practice of the press conference was everything's off the record, but if you really want to use something, you could ask Steve Early, the press secretary, can we use that? And Steve would say, you know, yes, you can, but you can't quote it, you have to paraphrase it, and you can attribute it to, you know, a White House official or something like that. And by the way, and this is the forum in which FDR announced the single most brilliant idea I'm aware of, invented entirely in the mind of a president with no advice. And that was Lend-Lease, which he conceived of when he was on a Navy ship in the Caribbean, just sitting alone on the deck. And so he describes this entire Lend-Lease idea of how to support the British with munitions and war equipment. And at the very end of it all, one of the reporters says to him, how do we attribute this? And FDR said, oh, you can attribute it to me. And that was the moment when they realized, oh, this is huge news. And so it was a huge, you know, front page thing the next day. And what you see in the transcripts of those press conferences is the job of the White House correspondent, they believe, is to illuminate to readers in Kansas City and San Francisco and Boston and Atlanta what this White House is doing, what this presidency is doing. It was their job, they believed, was to illuminate. There was very little, there was nothing of what you'd call confrontational. For example, in that press conference, FDR begins by saying, now this is legally complex and the lawyers are going to have to work on this, so don't ask me about that, about the legal stuff. And the third or fourth question is a lawyer question. It's a legal question. And FDR says, I told you not to ask me about the lawyer stuff. And everyone gets it. In other words, and he would very often say, I don't know. His answer to questions would very commonly be, I don't know. And if you go to today's world, if a president is standing there in a press conference environment and says, I don't know, that would be the glaring headline of the next day of how, in effect, incompetent this president is, because the Nixon presidency changed all of this. You know, you can look at the JFK press conferences on video now online, and it's the same spirit. You know, they think this president is, you know, faithful to the job and doesn't have to be prosecuted when he stands up there, and you can see a kind of understanding between the president and the press corps, and there's laughing, and there's, you know, there's questions that press him and that he tries to evade, and they get it. And then you get to Nixon, and it becomes prosecutorial quite legitimately. You know, and Woodward and Bernstein are outside of the White House press corps, which was very important. It was very, very important, by the way, that Watergate was not cracked by the White House press corps. They have never cracked anything. And so Woodward and Bernstein are doing this work, that's informing what's going on in the White House press corps, and they become prosecutorial. And they have remained prosecutorial. And that means every single president that appears in front of them is a defendant. And every one of them is to be treated exactly the same way, with exactly the same emphasis whenever we can possibly catch them at something. And so, and this is hugely enabling of Trump, hugely. And it explains a great deal of how Trump got to where he got. This is a White House press corps now that treats Joe Biden saying the word Mexico when he meant the word Egypt in an otherwise completely cogent description of an extremely complex crisis in the Middle East. That word substitution, that incorrect retrieval, as neurologists call it, of the word you were looking for, is treated exactly the same as Donald Trump in the midst of the COVID pandemic when there's no vaccine, suggesting to people, you might want to drink some bleach, or you might want to take some home cleaner and inject it into your body. Those two things had about exactly the same excitement reaction and gotcha reaction from the White House press corps. One of them deserved it, and one of them didn't. And that is a crucial element of the kind of, just the wallpaper of that environment of the way politicians and presidents especially, and presidential candidates are dealt with by the press corps, and they have never, ever, ever had a meeting at any one of these news organizations or the White House press corps, which has its own organization. They've never had a meeting to say, hey, this Trump thing is different. What do we do? I mean, this is really different. How do we cover this? And the other thing that's been lost, obviously, in this particular prosecutorial White House press corps mode is an utter disability on the evaluation of a job well done. The White House press corps during World War II knew when FDR was doing the job well because you could get the real results of what happened on D-Day. No one was lying to you about what happened on D-Day, and that was very much, his conception and direction of how to do that. We don't know how to say a job well done. Sports does. If you look at sports coverage, they know how to say a job is well done. It's much easier. I get it. It's much easier. And by the way, I think this is a bias of my own. I think one of the gigantic faults of political coverage is the lack, and governmental coverage, which is totally different. Politics is one thing, government is another thing, and then there's a third subject, which is the politics of governing, which is the most complex of all. But the only experience reporters generally have is covering political campaigns, and they think that's what it's all about. If you watch sports at all, if you watch basketball games or football games, when they cut to the basketball pundits or the football pundits at halftime, every single one of them is a quarterback who won a Super Bowl. They actually know what they're talking about. They actually did it, And unfortunately for the reporters, they live outside the actual thing they're trying to cover. The governing takes place in a room with the door closed, and then, they get to cover the speeches. It would be as if you covered the Super Bowl by having all the players, everybody come to New Orleans or wherever you're having the Super Bowl. And when it's time for the game, we close the door, we don't let any reporters in, we don't let any family members in, we don't let any observers in at all. And the way you find out, the way you decide who's good at this, is when the players come out of the stadium, they make speeches. And then you decide who's good at this. That's really what you're watching in coverage of government, anyway.
Before we go to your questions in a few minutes, but I want to touch back on this kind of wellspring moment of the late 60s that we've been talking about. I mean, you look at 1968, again, subject to one of Lawrence's books, as a time when this turned in a kind of phase change way, when presidential politics became entertainment, became a show. Several things. I could go on more than several, but for instance, you have, in September of that year, a show which had started earlier in the year was the #1 hit, was this amazing transformative show, Laugh-In, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. What happens? The former vice president, now running for president, Richard Nixon, running for president again, Richard Nixon goes on and does a funny bit, which is him saying the laugh-in catchphrase, "sock it to me," in this ridiculous Richard Nixonian "sock it to me" way. And it was funny, and it showed, wow, this guy is not just a stiff, he's got a sense of humor about himself. Now, is that why he won? Didn't hurt, But again, it was like an unthinkable thing that this hippie, liberal Hollywood show that Richard Nixon would go on and do well and help himself in the campaign. As you could point to 70-odd years later, or 50-odd years later, and Donald Trump going on Saturday Night Live, or Sarah Palin going on Saturday Night Live and doing not dissimilar things. But again, back to 1968. Lawrence reminded me the other day of what we've talked about in the past. This William F. Buckley, Gore Vidal debate. Again, they've made documentaries about that. They have not made documentaries about the Nixon-Humphrey debates of 1968, because it was this extraordinary thing of these two unapologetically conservative, left-wing people going at it with each other as entertainment around the election. It was extraordinary television. It was incredibly entertaining. And I don't know, not particularly illuminating, but man, Gore Vidal versus William F. Buckley was really entertaining. And then, of course, you had in Chicago, at the disastrous Democratic Convention, the yippies, Abbie Hoffman, who saw himself as a revolutionary entertainer, effectively. He understood, oh, TV is going to be covering this. We're going to take full advantage of that in a way that I think was groundbreaking and world-changing. Now, the other thing, again, that we look at, or I looked at in my book Fantasyland about the late 60s, is this, again, this thing that had been a chronic part of the American character, in my view, which is this subjectivity and this I know the truth. Enough with you what you professors say or you establishment people say, I feel and I know the truth, became and this anti-establishmentism that was at the, for better, much for better, but also for worse, was at the heart of the American founding idea. These things became kind of floridly, newly, erupting in the late 1960s in a new way. As did this extreme, in many ways, unchristian Christianity that was part of our founding, an aspect of our founding Christianity in this country too. So this also became extreme and culturally important in a way it hadn't been, certainly during, for most Americans for most of the 20th century, starting in the late 60s and early 70s. As well as the academic idea that there is no empirical reality, again, a cultural left idea that that it's all about the observer and the people who believe in this fantastical version of the world instead of science have as much right to that as anybody else. Well, fine as far as it went, but all of those things, you fast forward through the invention of the internet, again, and talk radio and cable TV news, all of the things that Lawrence was talking about enabling Trumpism and MAGA, that set of cultural ideas that came out of the born and erupting as they did in the late 60s, who does that ultimately enable? It did not enable the socialist revolution, such as it was, that people wanted in 1970. It has enabled MAGA, that I can believe whatever I want, and political violence is sometimes necessary, and the whole rest. So again, it's back to what Lawrence said about primaries, great idea, but be careful what you wish for because there are unintended consequences.
Right. So there's 13 minutes and 57 seconds left in this discussion. And I guess there's a microphone here, so if people want to line up for questions. I was hoping we could leave cable news out of this. Cable news, as we know it, was invented in 1996. MSNBC went on the air July 15th, 1996 at 9 a.m.
Wasn't there CNN for a few years?
No, that's the point. This is very important.
Okay.
CNN left alone would be a very different environment. There was once one gas station on this corner, and now there's three, and that changes the corner. So So July 15th, 1996 at 9 a.m., MSNBC goes on the air, and I think I make my first comments as a pundit at about 9:20 a.m. that day. Fox comes on a few months later in 1996, and no cable operator wants Fox News. They have absolutely no way of penetrating the cable system. NBC already owned a cable channel that they basically renamed so that they had instant access to cable systems. So Rupert Murdoch had to pay cable systems, had to pay them to carry Fox News. And now cable systems pay Fox News more than any other network to carry Fox News. That's how successful it became. And so without this diversity of cable news that ended up giving you a Republican channel, a completely pro-Republican channel, there could be no Trump. So it's a crucial part of it. Obviously, without the internet, there could be no Trump. Without social media, there could be no Trump success. Those are all parts of the 21st century components of this discussion that I think you're all even more familiar with than we need to belabor here. And a point just before we go to a question here that I want to make. This is a measurement. It's a scientific measurement of how far off the news media that we kind of grew up relying on has been from the ability to cover Trump. The first time I called Trump a liar and used the word lie in describing what he was saying was on my show in 2011 when Donald Trump began talking about Barack Obama's birth certificate. And he was doing that on the Today Show and all sorts of shows without any real resistance. And so I called him a liar about that. And no one knew you could do that. No one at my network knew you could do that. No one said anything to me about it, but no one else did. You know, that word didn't appear in your news coverage of politicians at any point since, you know, Nixon had to leave the White House. The New York Times first used the word lie to describe something Donald Trump said exactly 5 years later. It was September of 2016, and by the time the New York Times used the word lie, Donald Trump was the Republican nominee for president. And what was it that the New York Times was deciding we can break our mold finally and call this a lie? It was what Donald Trump said about Barack Obama's birth certificate. That took 5 years. So that's the media system that has failed to figure out how to deal with this phenomenon. Let me just say right away, if I were running the New York Times, I do not know how to do it. I don't know how, but I would have meetings. I would struggle. I would try to figure it out. But it's something and I'm using the New York Times to represent the entire kind of media that works by those rules. And they have not figured out how to do this. Please, go ahead.
I am a psychoanalyst by training and credential. I'm saying that because the next question is going to come from that background. Have you considered, Mr. Andersen, that you have actually understated the case when you call this fantasy land? I would suggest it's delusional land.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I used that word repeatedly in the book, and at one point had a large chapter trying to synthesize my months spent studying your field to try to apply that, but then I thought I could pretend to be an economist, I could pretend to be an historian, but I wasn't going to pretend to be a psychoanalytical diagnostician. But 100%, and it's on this mass level, you know, and I make some unkind conclusions in my book about the fact that a certain kind of religious theological extremism and supernaturalism, it wasn't hard to see how that became a place that could also, where what I regard as a certain kind of credulity could transfer over to the political sphere. So yes, absolutely. Delusion is a perfectly fine word.
So let me follow up then with the second point of my question. What you have been talking about, from my point of view, is a culture of narcissism. It's not the first time that's been used. And the question then becomes, first, are we all delusional? My answer, yes. The question is, how delusional and in what ways? And the second piece of that is, are we all narcissistic? And my answer to that is yes. But in what ways and how? Because that's what you have been describing, both of you, a narcissistic culture, a culture of the I, for sure. Enough said.
Write the book.
Thank you.
And as you know, all or the latest idea about in psychology and psychological pathology is that everything is on a spectrum, right? Everything is non-binary. You're not crazy or sane, you're somewhere on the spectrum. And now we have a political party that is indulging people on that end of the spectrum. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
So the tighter your question, the kinder you are being to the questioner behind you, who will get a chance to ask a question.
I'll be brief. So in the 60s, the conventions had, at least on the Democratic side, had a big influence on the campaign, even in '72, and adjusted to unforeseen circumstances. Do you have any opinions on whether that's could possibly happen in either party this year?
There's a possibility of messy conventions, but so far they've both been designed this year to be as smooth as possible with highly predictable nominees. Go ahead.
Do you think now that more reporters are now becoming stars themselves and not really covering the news? They just want to be a star. So some of the political candidates just try to help them become stars?
Yeah, it's a big problem. That's kind of what the gotcha question is about. It's that if you ask the question that creates the pops online or on television, then you have enhanced your reputation and attention to you, and so there's a perverse incentive now in the White House press corps. It kind of created, again, inadvertently by Sam Donaldson, if you can remember how combative he could be, during the Nixon presidency in the White House press briefing room, and that made Sam Donaldson a star, and that created an infection that corps lives with to this day.
Did they do that with the newspaper back way long ago? With newspaper, they had two different sides?
Yeah, it's a similar phenomenon. Let's go to the next question.
Thanks. When I think about the impact of the 1968 election, I think about race. I think about the Southern strategy of Nixon appealing to whites in the South, and it's the moment when the South starts to turn from Republican to Democrat. And then you move forward to Willie Horton helping to elect Bush 1, and then the backlash to the first black president. So if you could talk about how race relates to this movement.
You're absolutely correct, but that would take not only the next 4 minutes and 14 seconds, but another hour. But absolutely. I mean, substantively speaking, beyond the coverage things we're talking about or treating it as a show, obviously, yes. And I'm going to have a conversation about this with various historians this afternoon. I believe, and it's clear, that the race and the backlash to it and the manipulated backlash to it is the other part of the story of where we are with this authoritarian MAGA moment.
Great. Next question.
Yes, I wanted to ask, because you have not put this in there, is that Trump, whether disingenuously or not, has appealed to a lot of people who feel that they have not been heard for a very, very long time. And then you have the press coming in and almost attacking that, which has almost created a fervor against them, for mass media, because they take little sound bites and they just, and so those people who are very supportive of him feel attacked. So how does that really blend? I'm not saying he's genuine in what he's saying about supporting them, but they believe it. So how does that blend in with what the media is doing in the press corps and so forth?
I'm going to give that to the neutral observer of the media.
I mean, obviously, this sense of persecution, which again has a 500-year history from the Pilgrims feeling persecuted and these extreme Puritans feeling persecuted in England and the Netherlands coming here, is a thing that, starting with civil rights, the right and the Republicans have used effectively, and there's no way around it. I mean, you can send reporters again and again into diners to talk to Trump voters and find out how they think, and oh yes, they have a point, they feel left behind, they feel ill-used, and they are, and they have been, but using that, once you have an organization devoted to whipping that, keeping that sense of persecution, and a television network and Fox News, I mean, at some point, it's not up to us to be no, let's keep trying to understand.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've been thinking a lot about the last episode of The West Wing when President Bartlett was on his way out of Washington, not sure what his successor was going to be up to, and he was asked, "What are you thinking about?" And he said, "Tomorrow." I desperately want there to be a tomorrow for democracy in this country. And we seem to have a whole array of forces aligned to destroy democracy, to destroy what we have lived with in this country since its beginning. So my question is, I see a shift in the way media has been covering democracy, covering the campaigns, the primaries. What do you think the media can do in the time that's left before the election to focus on getting the facts out there, getting the truth out there, and what can we do as people who want there to be tomorrow for democracy do to change the conversation, to present the truth when there's so much aligned against it? Thank you.
You know, this is the worst thing that can happen on television, which is the most important point is made when there are 0 seconds left on the clock. And I have to go to a commercial from this brilliant thing that someone has just said. Literally, it's 0 time on the clock. So the only thing I'll say to that, we can all ponder it, is that John Wells wrote that last episode of The West Wing, a beautiful piece of work. There wouldn't have been a West Wing TV show without John Wells. He was the crucial executive producer who got it on the air, who hired all of us as writers. I think I wrote the 3rd from the last or 2nd from the last episode of the show. And I would suggest, if you're looking for hope and you don't find it in cable news, find those episodes of The West Wing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.